This interview is a part of Baylor University's oral history program, part of our Religion and Culture series. My name is Dan McGee. I'm professor of religion at Baylor, and today we're talking with Reverend M.L. Cooper, who is pastor of the Second Baptist Church here in Waco. It's July the 3rd, 1980, about 10 a.m., and Reverend Cooper, we appreciate very much your giving us this time today.
So I'm happy to be with you.
All right. Well, let's begin at the beginning. Would you give us your full name and the place and date of your birth?
My name is Marcus Langley Cooper, Jr. I was born June the 23rd, 1917, in Austin, Texas.
Marcus Langley. Are those family names or?
My father's name is I am Jr.
Right.
and Langley, both more or less from my father's side. I don't know how far back the Marcus and the Langley may reach.
Well, tell us about your family, beginning with your parents. Now, what you say Austin, was that the place where your father grew up?
Austin is sort of the area where my mother grew up. She grew up in Sprinkle, Texas. That's just a short drive out from Austin, Texas, on the north side of the city. A small community, but near Austin, Texas. So actually I was conceived in Hearn and born in Austin. And my father at that time was living in Hearn, Texas. I may just state that he came to Hearn, Texas he was brought to Hearn, Texas because he was 5 years old from Greenville, North Carolina. A whole company of the Cooper clan. His mother and father, sisters and brothers, cousins and uncles, kind of a caravan of them came into Texas and settled in Hearn. I don't know just what brought them to that section. So Hearn from 5 years
Right.
through his early marriage.
You say you don't know why they settled in Hearn, but do you know any of the circumstances as to why they left North Carolina? And I know that there was a lot of migration during that period
Right.
from the Carolinas and Virginia this way, but do you know the specifics of their migration?
I think some of that information is available, but I don't have it at this moment.
Right.
I guess sometimes we know that we have the information, and so we sort of let it stay in certain areas
Right.
until we really approached about it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, now your father's family were they farmers?
Farmers, yes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Farmers around Hearn, and then what about your father? What was he doing after his marriage?
Now, during his marriage and the early part of his marriage, actually he farmed in Hearn and pastored.
Oh, yes.
Now, during his early pastorate, or early ministry, I would say, he was a part of a program that our convention had, and that's by way of missionary on the field. A number of preachers who did not have churches. Some doors were open in some churches here and there, and he, along with a number of others of this sort during the early ministry, were sort of welcomed into various churches, by and large in their district, which association of district.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other ministers in your father's family, or was he the first one to move in that direction?
as far as I can recall, he was the first one to move in that direction.
Do you have any stories about how your father and mother met? How they got
Yes.
together?
Yes, they met in what we called academy. This was a type of college at that time, and they were both students.
Where was this located?
This was Oakwood, Texas. Our convention still owns the property there, but other than that, it naturally became sought out. I don't know. Well, it was closed some
Right.
years, short
Right.
years after that.
Well, that was true of a lot of the academies of that period. They served their purposes and were
Right.
later closed. Um, well, it strikes me as maybe unusual that the children of a farm family would be that industrious educationally.
Right.
Is that true? What prompted your father and your mother too to be striving for higher educational levels? Were they encouraged by their families or just what?
I think both and. There was no obstacles in the way, and as I see it from my relationship, this was a kind of dream. My father was called to the ministry. This was his commitment, and of course, he wanted to get some training. And even after I grew up as a lad of a boy, wherever there were some kind of workshops of this nature, we'd see him moving in that direction to get some more learning and more knowledge.
Right.
Now, my mother took in the academy. She was interested in the work of seamstress.
Oh, yeah.
And she made hats. Even when I was a lad of a boy, I used to carry some hats that she made to beauty parlors, and they put them in the window. Those who came to get their hair processed or fixed, they try on the hats, and if they liked it, they bought it, and the beautician shared some of the profit, or my mother shared some of the profit with the beautician.
Well, what do you know about your mother's family and their background?
Here again, more or less of my knowledge of my mother and her background, they were farming people, grew up around Sprinkle, Texas, and I did get to know my grandmother on both sides, but I never did get to know my grandfathers that died before my arrival, before my knowledge. And she had one brother to pastor, to preach. He did pastor.
Did you know him?
Yes, I knew him.
What was his name and where did he pastor?
Adam Keats Black.
All right.
He pastored during his early years in Port Arthur. Used to drive down maybe once or twice a month. And then he pastored out from Austin in the Pflugerville area. And then finally, that was during the early years when really you had 1 and 2 Sunday a month churches,
Right.
more than you. After that, he organized a church during my early childhood. Organized a church in Austin, Texas. He pastored there until his death in 1956, I believe.
You recall the name of that church?
Rising Star Baptist
The
Church.
Rising Star. All
Yes,
right.
it's still there now.
Right. I've heard of that church.
Mhm.
All right. then your parents were married and moved to Austin
in 1922.
in 22.
Uh-huh. In fact, my dad and mother, and along with the children, went to Austin, and the flood of 1922 came in Texas, and the tracks were washed out, and my dad could not get us back to, because the tracks washed immediately.
Yeah.
And of course, this was the answer to my mother's prayer. She wanted us to grow up in Austin,
Why?
her community.
Oh, her
This-
community.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And of course, with the tracks washed out and not being able to get back to Hearn, my dad began to put his roots in Austin. He had some jobs that he worked.
I was going to ask you, how did he support the family? He was
Yes.
away from his farming now,
Right.
but you said he was doing some preaching.
Some preaching and also just jobs where he could find. Mhm.
What churches were he associated with at that time?
All right. Very shortly after being in Austin, he organized a church. That date I don't have it, but I was just this was doing. We're looking at about 6 years or 7 years old then, and he organized this church, and its name was St. Matthew Baptist Church. Within several years, one of his minister friends fixing to retire, and from a church in Austin. So he told him about it, informed him, and the church called my dad and invited the union of these two churches.
Oh, yes.
And then I may say one thing unique. Many times Baptist churches have been accused of splitting, but my dad was able to unite 1, 2, 3 churches in his ministry.
Well, that's
And
interesting.
the church is still in Austin now. Peaceful St. James Baptist Church. So,
Well, was that the final church
That was the
merged
final.
of these three?
right.
And that church is still in existence.
In existence now.
In Austin.
Mhm.
How long was your father pastor there,
He-
approximately?
45 years.
My,
Yeah, 45 years.
well, he really built it then, didn't he?
That's right. It's relatively, would not be what we call the large church. It's not the small church. It's, I'd call the average.
Do you still have close ties with that church?
I go back occasionally.
Mhm.
And we have been trying, just most recently, trying to work out a fellowship, a date with them.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your early childhood. I find it fun sometimes to try to recall some of the first things I could remember as a
Mhm.
child. What are some of the most vivid memories of your childhood and your family life? Things. What do you? What's the earliest date you can remember anything?
Well, I guess one we sort of enjoy as a family talking about, at least my sisters and my brother. My brother is 14 months younger than I am, and I am the oldest child. When my sister was born in Hearn, the doctor came, and of course he parked up on the highway and came through the gate, and we saw him with his handbag. This was a white doctor. And my two cousins sort of babysat with us and to keep us away from the house. And because when the doctor went back to his car down the lane, we had a sister, and
Yeah.
our thoughts were that he brought my sister in that
That bag.
bag.
Great. Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, tell us about you say you have one brother and how many sisters?
Two sisters.
Two sisters.
Mhm.
For the record, give us their names and where they live and
Yeah.
what they do.
All right, my brother is pastoring in Boston.
And his name is?
William Lonnie Cooper. He has been pastoring there now for 10 years. Prior to that, he pastored in Newport, Rhode Island for 21 years. I may just state he is in that location because of going to school at Andover Newton Seminary, and then getting married while there in West Newton, Mass. And of course, with a family and with some connections, he was called to the Shiloh Baptist Church, Newport, Rhode Island.
All right.
And of course, when there was a phase out, Newport is kind of a naval base area. When there was a phase out some few years ago, about a little better than 10 years ago now, yeah, the population sort of decreased, and he went to Boston as a chaplain in industry for Ravenel
Mm-hmm.
Industries. Of course, while there, one of the churches asked him to serve as kind of interim pastor, and then they called him.
All right. Well, what about your sisters now?
Now, my two sisters, my older sister is named Carrie Bernice Hurt. She's a retired teacher now, living in Houston, but most of her work as a teacher was put in at Elkhart, Texas. That's a few miles from Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
Her husband is a retired teacher, also served even as principal there for some years. My baby sister is named Doris Annette Curvey, and she is teaching in the public schools in Houston. Her husband is a preacher. He started preaching after they married, of course, and he is working in the administrative division of the Houston Independent School District.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, let's go back to your early days. Tell us about your education. You began, I guess, in public school
In Austin.
in Austin.
Mm-hmm. We were living there then.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like in public schools? The schools were segregated.
Right. We had to walk. I tried to think of how many miles when I knew we would be kind of talking together on it. I guess I walked some 3 miles, as I can travel a distance even
Yeah.
now if I went to Austin to check it out. But approximately 3 miles. Give a little, take a little. And we walked every day back and forth.
Did you enjoy school?
Yes. I don't remember, just really hating school.
Yeah.
There may have been days that I wish that school would go away, but under normal conditions, this was a thing you would do, and maybe for somebody else it would, but our parents encouraged us all the way, so all 4 of us did go through college, go up and
Yes.
through public school and
Yeah.
through college.
Well, your parents then must have been as you said, encouraging all of you. Was there a kind of expectation from the beginning, as you can remember, that that education was important and that you would go on and probably go to college?
I think there was a strong hope.
Yeah.
Yes, a strong hope as I look on it now, because sometimes these things are happening and it's you're doing it automatically, but underneath you, after you grow older and reflect. But there was a hope, because my mother used to worry about my brother not finishing his seminary work, and of course I told her that she was worried more about it than he was, because he was old enough to know he had finished college, Bishop College, and he did go to Andover Newton. He didn't finish his seminary work, but maybe he had much more than some other pastors would have.
Well, from your early school days, do you recall any favorite teachers or any important, subjects that you liked, or anything that stood out during your elementary and then junior high school days?
I can't remember just really putting my finger on subjects per se.
What did you do other than go to school as you kind of grew up?
Yes, I did work. We had little jobs that we would do. There was one family that kind of my family had sort of worked with, and we had little jobs. So during my earlier years as a kid of a boy, lad of a boy, we used to go down and carry wood in for for a family.
Right.
My brother and I would go, and then as we grew older, we had little jobs here and there.
Well, were times pretty difficult financially?
Yes, this was really during the Depression periods, and you find a job, piddle here with a job and there with a job, just wherever you could find a job, pick up. Because the family was not solely dependent upon, because my dad did work and did pastor. And during some of those years he pastored in Austin, and then he had a church that he would go up once a month to Blanco, Texas. And many times being hard, they would pay him some of his salary, we put it on that basis, was paid in tomatoes, potatoes,
Produce, yeah.
produce,
Right.
chickens, eggs.
Yeah.
And we would be waiting for him to turn in the driveway with his T-model Ford
Yeah.
from Blanco.
Well, what do you recall from your church life as a child? You were, of course, your father being a pastor. I imagine you as a family were
Close to it.
close to the church and involved. What was it? What are your memories of those experiences?
Well, they were very unique experiences. We were close to the church, and here again, I'm somewhat amazed at parents now who ask their children, even some at the church where I pastor, do you want to stay for church? Well, we didn't have no choice. I didn't know you could raise. I didn't know that these questions and choices existed. You went to church, and as long as you were under their discipline and under their roof and sleeping in the bed they'd provided and under the shelter, no, you just didn't have no choice there. But we enjoyed it. We were involved, and we were part of the choir, part of the whatever youth activities we existed, Sunday school, right on through the whole day's activities we were involved. And I don't regret it. I often say this, I don't regret it one bit. Some parents now, and I think I'd just like to put this in, some parents now say they don't want to make their children do what, but I thank the Lord for my people, my parents who knew this was best. In fact, parents try to look out for the best for their children. They do other things, urging them to do this and that. And so we were close to the church. During those years, you had a good number of things that maybe I don't see in maybe some church life, and that is plays and other activities that she didn't have as many distractions, many other things going on that involve our youth.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, what kind of youth activities? You mentioned those. They did plays, pageants, those sorts of things. Did they do other things like some youth groups today are involved in athletics as a part of their church activity?
You didn't have too much of that.
Not much of that.
No.
Fellowships of different kinds, or
You did have fellowships, where the churches get together. I guess that still goes on, because it's more in the service area, services, worship services, more than anything else.
what was the kind of pattern of church activities and services that you were a part of? Every Sunday.
Every Sunday, right.
What about church activities during the week?
The activities were very limited. You had maybe certainly the choir rehearsal, and you had a type of Shepherd Boys League, YMCA and Shepherd Boys League. Young men's type of, and you had it for the YWA, Young Women's Association, as they call it. Starlight Band, that was for the younger ones. Shepherd Boys League. Comparing it today, it's kind of like the RA that you have with Southern Baptist.
You mentioned your activity in the choir. As you were growing up, when did you begin to recognize that you had certain talents or interests in the area of public speaking and leadership in the church?
I don't know whether I could really put my hand on this. As I look back, though, of course, this is what you're raising the question many times. We're doing something, we don't know what happens until something else has happened.
Right.
But some of the deacons of that church where my dad pastored used to sort of encourage me and thank me for some things that I would do. Here was something that needed to be done. Maybe even a chair moved to where somebody could sit down. This moved out of the way, to name just a few things. But I found myself doing them when nobody had to ask me. And the deacons observed that I was sort of handy, and they appreciated it, at least to this extent, to make mention of it. As I look on it now, and it sort of, I guess it sort of concerns me now when you see individuals who around and see so many things that can be done, and they can do it without offending, and they can do it with helping somebody, and they fail to do it. Maybe they're unconscious of it, or maybe just don't know. But it was in this area that maybe whatever was eventually to be was sort of coming out. One of the things I've often thought about too, for several years as children, my dad worked in town. He worked with the Capitol Carpet Cleaners in Austin, Texas. My uncle owned this business, my mother's brother, and my dad was sort of the manager, which included everything, working, keeping the business going.
Yeah.
And to get back to what I was thinking about, we had to go to the cotton patch for several years. But even out there, and I guess I remember this more at that time when we were away from everybody. But my mother used to tell us, she'd get us around her and tell us about Booker T. Washington. About, I don't remember what all she said, but I just remember it was a kind of a, these are some folks who have attained,
Yeah.
you know. And I remember in a kind of a limited way. My ambition, I don't know when this came about during my years growing up, but my ambition was to be a doctor. And for this reason, even when I went to college, I majored in the science and chemistry field. It's quite unique when you think of this, because we had a boy when I went to the seminary who had wanted to become a doctor, and he was in the medical field then at Howard School of Medicine. But he was saying that if he hadn't have gotten in the School of Medicine, his next move would have been the ministry. So somewhere along the line, I guess this desire, dream to help people is there. It comes out eventually. Because it would have been almost a struggle that I couldn't imagine if I'd gotten in the medical field as high as it was, and with the way money was limited at that time. I remember one boy from Austin who did go, and it seemed like some of the churches in Austin had to lift offerings to help he and his family. And his dad had a pretty fair job. I think he was mail clerk, one among the few black mail clerks on the train, the MK&T, one of the trains that went through Austin.
Yeah. Well, I grew up in Baptist churches too, and have good memories of a lot of good things that happened. I also remember church fights.
Yeah.
I remember the difficulties some families, for example, in the churches had getting along with other families.
Yeah.
Okay. That's a part of church life, or it
right.
was mine.
It's mine too.
Do you recall? Let's talk about that. Any memories that you have? No, don't necessarily have to name names, but
No.
get a picture of of the kinds of things your father as a pastor had to deal with, and that you as a child remember. Are there any things in that area that you recall?
Yes, I do recall them. I recall, I guess, the first experience in that field was a business meeting that was called by the church. I was lad of a boy to put my dad out. And because I just kind of remember Mother saying that when we vote, he told us to vote when they voted.
Yeah.
And how they vote, with them. And it was this deacon recommended that my dad, he didn't like the way he preached. And and maybe administered his church affairs either. So the church voted on it because my dad, I believe he presided. Anyhow, he was part of the leadership. Wasn't no big wrangling, and they voted, and of course my dad was given a positive vote. And of course my dad immediately asked that he be dismissed as a deacon. And of course the church sustained my dad's recommendation. Of course the next day, the same deacon came by, kept the carpet clean where my dad worked, and he was crying to him that he was mistreated, and that, of course, he was apologizing and so forth. My dad, as I remember, did forgive him, but he didn't put him back on the deacon board.
Do you recall the substance of the man's complaint? Do you recall what it was really about? Or did he have any?
I don't think he had no real complaint, as I remember him, even through some of the other years. He was limited in the first place, and I guess he wanted many times these fights of power struggles.
Yeah.
And he was struggling for power, control.
About how old were you then, and did it frighten you? As a boy, to see someone doing that or threatening your father, what was your reaction?
Well, I guess my reaction, my dad was, he had a type of temper, and yet he only used it when he had to. And so he wasn't, and my mother was quiet in her deliberations. So I think all this helped too. Sometimes we look at each other and they saw someone think I have my mother's nature and the ninth hour my dad's nature rise up. But they were concerned but not disturbed. So I think this helped to keep us on a kind of a calm area in terms of, at that time I wouldn't say as I say now that this is a part of the package, but this was a thing that we went through, and life moved on.
Well, you mentioned a while ago the Depression. Your late 20s, 30s.
Right.
What do you recall from those years? What are your memories of Depression? When people mention the Depression, what kind of memories come back to you?
I guess some of the main memories are that in one way or another, keep pushing, you can make it. In other words, we made it. I've oftentimes said that there were times, I mentioned right up here the other day, that there were times when we carried maybe more money to church as a family, which was not a whole lot, than my dad brought back as his salary. But we made it. There were times when maybe somebody needed shoes, in the family, my sister, my brother, including myself, we needed this or that, and in a kind of way, somebody would come by and want to get married, and they didn't, receive too much for marriages, but it was just always some kind of door open that, of course, everything was down to the minimum. I remember when some days we lived kind of on the edge of Austin, maybe a type of edge of Austin. Well, fellas would go out and hunt rabbits. You could get they come in with the rabbits across the shoulders. You get a rabbit for 25 cents or less.
Yeah.
And so in one way or another, we were able to. And then my mother worked for a family. In fact, several of us, by way of family, worked for that family. It was a family that owned the Yellow Cab Company in Austin,
What was their name?
the Pattons.
Uh-huh.
Their children were along the age of us.
Mhm.
So they had 2 sons and a daughter, and they were almost same age as that.
Mm.
So many times my mother worked for her, and so we had clothes
Yeah.
that and what they threw away was, something we could use.
Mhm.
And then we had a neighbor who worked out at the University of Texas at one of the fraternity houses. And those boys would throw away stuff that was Sunday dress up for us.
Yes.
And he'd bring those, and our neighbor, and he's still living. So in these various ways, we were just able to. Even during my early years in college, going to Sam Houston and Tillerson, if you didn't pay your tuition and keep up your tuition, when the exams would come, they'd bring a slip in to the different teachers. Don't let. But when that slip came through the door, I knew my name was on that list. But we'd go down, talk with the president, talk with the bursar, and we'd set up a time when it'd be paid. And so I often laugh about that. Anytime that door opened.
You knew whose name was there.
That's
huh?
right. That's right. But we made it.
That's good. You mentioned this relationship to the family, white family that your mother and your brother worked
Right.
for. What was the extent and nature of your relationship with that family? Would you consider yourself close to them?
Yes, I would.
Do you-
In fact, I grew up, and here again, I grew up on East Avenue, which is Highway 35 now, going through Austin up on this north end. On the other, between Concordia and Concordia Presbyterian, I believe that's Presbyterian School, and downtown. And in the 2 blocks, so to speak, where I live, the black area. In fact, my grandmother lived on one side, and my uncle, who was pastor, lived on the other side. Several cousins, and another uncle was married to my mother's sister. And then all below that were whites, going right on down to where that stadium, not stadium, but where the Coliseum is.
Mhm.
And of course, there was a bushy area between East Avenue and the University Stadium now.
Mhm.
And his family lived between there on one of the few streets. But I mention that because as a lad or boy, we used to go down and look at University of Texas, and climb over the fence, and
Mhm.
when the gates opened, we were let in, or we climbed over the fence, and they'd chase us, and,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so forth. It was so this family, we were close.
Mhm.
And I made mention of living kind of in this kind of area because it was an experience that I had. I've often mentioned it meant so much to me. We never know when as parents, we're impressing children. But beyond East Avenue, there was the black area, which we call really black land. Very few blacks lived on East Avenue. So we were sort of the borderline between, and the blacks, as a gang, would run the whites with rocks. whites, there's a gang would run the blacks, and sometimes the white boys had horses, they'd run them with their horses. But we were in between, which put us neither fish nor fowl. But one day coming from school, we had to come naturally through on up East Avenue, and some of the boys kind of rocked us. And we went in home crying and running and crying. And my mother got a hat, put it on, said, "Come on." And she took my brother and I along with her. She knocked on all those doors and told them that she was trying to raise us, to get along with people. And she didn't want her children to be run. She's not going to let them run hers, and vice versa. And
How did they respond to her?
yeah, this was a good response.
Yeah.
It was a good community. It wasn't an antagonistic. You had it beyond the slavery. You had it. And yet there were times these same boys would run each other. They'd play together over in the backfield there. And I guess you get a leader from time to time that say, "Come on, let's run them."
Yeah. Cause some trouble.
Yeah. Sort of this kind of thing that, this kind of relationship. And after that, well, the boys didn't. We'd come home to school and come on back. Because my mother knew this had to be done because we all lived on East Avenue.
Yeah.
And just running and rocking every day, racially. Because Austin in general was pretty racially balanced as far as tension was concerned.
I was going to ask, what
Yeah.
was it like during your years there? Were there any significant periods of conflict? Any?
I don't remember any real significant periods of just what we call racial.
Was there a Klan? Was the Ku Klux Klan active? Or do you recall it?
I don't recall
Okay.
any of that. Austin was kind of, in terms of that, it was sort of an island when you think of some of the other cities. Because in '64, when the ruling came, I was president of the Austin branch in NAACP. I served there from '50 to '58 when I came here as president. And we were the first branch to carry a petition to a school board in the South. I think the record may show we were the first, but if not the first, we were among the first. We carried it. I think the bills were passed in the June, I believe in June, sometime in the spring. And we carried it before school opened in September of '64. And I got one threat by way of a letter. It was in '64. Went before school board asking them to integrate. And that year they voted, I mean, that before they opened up, they voted to start the program of integration. And they started with I believe with the 12th grade, and then we'll move back to the lower grade. So this was kind of what you had.
Right. So relative to what was going on in much of the rest of the South,
That's right.
it was relatively calm.
Right.
You mentioned your mother's talking to you about Booker T. Washington and holding up other heroes, other black heroes for you. Do you recall anything else that your parents or maybe other members of your family or church did in terms of informing you of your heritage, or as we say today, your roots? Were there any stories passed down to you about the experiences of your ancestors back in North Carolina or even before that?
Not too much. With my dad at the age of 5 being brought to her, and with all the family coming, maybe if we'd had some relatives that way. We've constantly been going back to, but this sort of pulled up
The roots.
the roots.
Yeah.
The roots were brought into here in Texas. So we didn't have as much.
When your grandfather came to Hearn, did he come? Did he settle as what we call a tenant farmer, or was he able to get his own land? Or do you?
I think he was able to get his own land. It could be, and of course, there were times when certain allotments of property were given to really made available
That's
to
right.
settlers.
That's right.
And no, we don't have any of that now. But anyhow, during my older years, my dad and his family did sell that property since I. It's on the east side of Hearn. Well, a number of those oil tanks are now. I remember all that as a kid when we'd go back to visit grandmother.
All right. Well, back to Austin, and you're finishing up your education there. What about your high school days? Did you participate as a high school student in any extracurricular activities like band or sports or choir or
Yeah.
or oratorical contests or anything like that? What were the kinds of things you enjoyed doing as a teenager?
By and large, I was almost always in the choir, high school and college and seminary.
Yeah.
In high school, I was involved in, I had hoped really to play my latter years in high school football, but I was at this place I worked, this family I made mention of, and I cranked up my dad's T-model to go to pick up some things for the family, and the car started up and ran over, knocked me down, turned me over under there, and left me sort of flattened out.
Yeah.
Went on down to the end of the hill there and stopped. And this shoulder really, sometime now when the weather changed, it will, and that was kind of in the middle 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And of course that kind of ended my career,
Mm-hmm.
of my hopes.
Yes.
I wouldn't say my career.
Yeah.
But other than that, plays, we were, in high school, in plays and choir, I was always involved in those kind of things.
Well, Reverend Cooper, we appreciate it. Our hour is about up. It's getting close to 11 o'clock, and I know that you have a busy day today taking care of responsibilities at your church. But we'll look forward to getting together for another session before long, I hope, and
All right.
pick it up at this point
Yes.
and begin to look at your years in college and seminary and,
Yes.
and all that follows.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Glad to have been with you.